everyone joining us for the first session entitled Napoleon at War. And I do appreciate it. It seems like we've got a number of folks from around the world. So thank you for joining us. I'm Professor Kenneth Johnson. I'm a professor at Air University, a specialist in French naval history. And I'd like to welcome you to a very interesting panel that'll look at several issues of Napoleon in command. Our first presenter will be Claudio Mann, who is a graduate student at the University of North Texas. He's working on his master's thesis, having worked a very interesting career in the oil industry beforehand, who reminds me of my good friend Jack Siegler. And so, yeah, I'll be very interested to see the perspective that you bring to your paper titled "The Lithuanian Quagmire: 2 Weeks That Cost Napoleon the Russian Campaign." And our second presenter will be Major Eric Smith, who is an Army strategist and planner for the Campaigns Plans Branch Chief at the U.S. Transcom, stationed out at Scott Air Force Base in Illinois. He's recently worked on a recent campaign plan on looking at the global deployment and distribution, and he's working on his PhD at UNT, where he's looking at how Napoleon commanded his armies. So first, I'd like to remind everyone to please send your questions through the chat to me. To cut down on internet trolling, we've sort of restricted the chat function, but please do send your questions to me. And we will then have Q&A at the end of both of their presentations. So first, Mr. Mann, would you like to start?
Thank you very much, Ken. I appreciate it. Well, I have to say, first of all, that I'm honored to be here. It's really a dream come true for me. And it is a joy to be able to share my ideas with this audience. I thank you for your willingness to listen to it. And without further ado, let's get started. So the classic theory that Napoleon was defeated by General Winter after the emperor ordered a retreat from Moscow is romantic, but difficult to embrace logically when all known facts are considered. Analyzing the events closely, it becomes evident that the more popular explanations of the French debacle provide only limited answers to the many questions they raise. The capture of the Kremlin, the burning of Moscow, and the horrific retreat often obscure the true causes of the French defeat. The purpose of my research is to go beyond the traditional explanations to uncover the root causes of the French calamity. Napoleon had predicted that the Second Polish War would be over in 20 days. Yet he spent 18 valuable days in Vilna between June 27th and July 15th, 1812, without achieving anything of substance militarily. In the interim, the Russians escaped entrapment, the Grand Army lost men at a terrifying rate, and the carefully stockpiled supplies would not reach the troops in the dilapidated Lithuanian roads. The extended stay in Vilna was not planned. Several problems, some self-inflicted, forced Napoleon to remain in the Lithuanian capital. Primarily, he needed to determine the location, direction, and strength of the Russian forces facing his center and right wing. Poor maps forced Chief of Staff Louis-Alexandre Berthier to rely on sketches and Croquis drawings. Unfortunately, the lack of good quality information made the military intelligence analysis slow and prone to errors. Also, weather conditions had deteriorated less than 1 week after the Grand Armée had crossed the Niemen River. A veritable deluge lasting 5 days drenched men and beasts, flooding roads and fields. This natural disaster severely affected delivery and distribution of essential army supplies. Finally, true to his personality, During the 18 days that he spent in Vilna, Napoleon devoted time and energy to establishing a Lithuanian government. In early July 1812, he appointed commissioners for the departments of Vilna, Minsk, and Bialystok, and sub-prefects for the towns of Vilna, Trakai, Asmiana, Vilkomir, Kovno, Shavli, and various others. He also occupied himself with naming various administrative and judicial officers of the city of Vilna, including the mayor, attorney general, comptroller, surgeon general, and all city council members. The emperor also concerned himself with the conscription of a Lithuanian National Guard, as well as 5 infantry and 4 cavalry regiments. On paper, that meant adding about 14,000 men to the Grande Armée. Not a negligible number, but still rather insignificant given all the other acute problems affecting Napoleon's army. Given the geographical and military conditions, the campaign had to be short. Napoleon understood this and planned for it. The French emperor's goal was to destroy the Russian army close to the border in a lightning strike after concentrating massive forces at a critical place and time. Napoleon would then dictate the terms of peace, sign a treaty, and return to Paris in triumph, all in less than 3 months. By the time he left Vilna to pursue the Russian army, Napoleon had essentially lost all the time that he had estimated would be needed to persuade Tsar Alexander to join him at the negotiating table. Napoleon recognized some of the issues his army would face, and so the Russian campaign was better prepared than many of his earlier military operations. In this instance, Napoleon took the initiative and chose the time and place to move into Lithuania, a province that had been part of the Commonwealth of Poland before the country's partition, hoping to be greeted as a liberator by the local population. The date of the invasion, the beginning of summer, was selected on account of the late emergence of suitable grass that would help feed the 190,000 beasts, including 140,000 horses that were placed in the army's service. In planning the campaign, Napoleon promptly identified the key challenges that he needed to overcome: achieving a decisive numerical superiority and keeping the army well supplied in a poor, sparsely inhabited country with a terrible infrastructure were his top imperatives. His answer to the first challenge was, in theory, correct: deploy the largest army that Europe had ever seen. Yet, the sheer size of the Grande Armée was at the same time its chief strength and its major weakness, as feeding such a multitude would only be possible for a very brief period. Thus, massive stocks of provisions for men and beasts, sufficient to feed his forces for at least 50 days, were placed in storage at strategically located magazines and depots. Napoleon may not have coined the phrase amateur stock tactics, professional stock logistics, but he certainly was not blind to its meaning. The supply and logistical difficulties involved in the Russian campaign of 1812 were daunting for the age, perhaps intractable. Meanwhile, Tsar Alexander and his army's high command pondered various military strategies and undertook diplomatic initiatives to make sure that Russia would not be isolated. Several military commanders and advisors submitted campaign plans to Tsar Alexander. Initially tempted to take the war to the enemy by invading Napoleon's Grand Duchy of Warsaw, Alexander eventually decided to fight a defensive war based on a strategy of attrition. A handful of advisors convinced the Tsar to deny Napoleon the opportunity to fight a decisive battle and to follow a scorched earth policy. The stiff Spanish resistance that stymied the French in Iberia, as well as Arthur Wellesley's success at the line of Torres Vedras, provided inspiration. According to the plan submitted by General Karl Ludwig von Pfuel, the farther the Grand Armée could be pulled away from its bases in East Prussia and Poland, the weaker and exposed it would be to flank attacks and the dangers of encirclement. Outside the protective umbrella of its supply chain, the French would be vulnerable to a counteroffensive. Despite its logic, the whole concept was hard to accept for Russians of all extractions, not to mention that Pfuel, the former chief of staff to Frederick William III at the time of Prussia's humiliation by Napoleon at Jena and Auerstedt, carried little clout with the Russian high command. Responding to Russian pride, the plan was presented so that the withdrawal would be limited to 100 to 125 miles, or about 5 days of effective march. The Russians believed this would be sufficient to lure Napoleon into a trap with an army that was numerically weaker due to strategic consumption and troop detachments, physically exhausted, hungry, and demoralized. The Tsar deployed 3 armies on his Western Front. The largest was the First Army under Field Marshal and Minister of War, Mikhail Andreas Barclay de Tolly, with close to 130,000 men and 600 artillery pieces. Barclay's various corps operated in the northern section of the front in Lithuania and Livonia. The Second Army, under the Georgian Prince Pyotr Romanovich Bagration, about 50,000 men, operated farther south, facing Grodno in today's western Belarus. Finally, the Third Army, of about the same size as Bagration's, was assembling in Volhynia, south of the Pripyat marshes, under General Alexander Pietrovich Tarmasov. The latter was positioned to protect Kiev and support Bagration's southern flank. The Russians, aware of the difficulties that the French and their allies would encounter, planned to multiply them. By forcing Napoleon to pursue them deep into their own territory, the Russians hoped that by the time the decisive battle was fought, he would have exposed his supply lines to attack, thus weakening his army, which could then be more easily destroyed. The Tsar forces would have their share of supply and logistic challenges as well, of course. However, operating with much smaller armies in their home territory and along shorter interior lines, their problems would be considerably more manageable. At the start of the summer 1812, 450,000 French and Allied troops began to cross the border amid cheers of "Vive l'Empereur!" On traversing the Niemen, the troops may have well roared the even older Latin expression, "Ave Imperator, moritori te salutant." Had they any inkling of the tragedy that was about to unfold? Approximately 150,000 additional men were held in reserve or garrisoned near the border and would be summoned to the front throughout the campaign. The invading force was divided in 3 armies. Marshal Etienne MacDonald commanded the left wing. The right wing was led by Jérôme Bonaparte, King of Westphalia, youngest brother of the French emperor. Napoleon, commanding the center, was soon en route to Vilna. In 3 days, the emperor covered the 65 miles between Kovno and the main Lithuanian town. The Imperial Guard entered Vilna at 9 a.m. on June 28th and secured it for the arrival of Bonaparte. The Russians had evacuated the historic city only hours earlier, and the local inhabitants celebrated the French arrival with great pomp, surrounded by sympathetic Lithuanian and Polish patriots. The Tsar, Barclay, and the bulk of the First Russian Army of the West withdrew east to safer positions. First to Vilkamir, then to Vidzi, and then to Drisa, the stronghold built on the eastern bank of the Dvina River. Some units also retreated to Dunebur. The movement designed to trap the Russians in front of Vilna had failed, but Napoleon was not alarmed yet. From his position, he could threaten either St. Petersburg or Moscow. From the beginning of the campaign, Napoleon suffered from a perennial lack of accurate information about the position, movement, strength, and state of the enemy. The Cossacks, screening the withdrawal and ensuring that nothing useful to the French was left behind, observed, harassed the advancing French troops, burning bridges, villages, and magazines in their wake. Consequently, the emperor troops marched in different directions in search of intelligence about the enemy's exact location. This fundamental problem was particularly critical during the early days, given that it was at this time that Napoleon hoped to inflict a decisive blow, and the whole provisioning of the army was synchronized with this timetable. Very important point. After processing the information received from the various corps, some dated and vague, Napoleon finally decided to direct the King of Naples, Joachim Murat, and Marshal Michel Ney towards the fortified area of Drissa in search of Barclay de Tolly and Tsar Alexander, while Marshal Louis-Nicolas Davout and Prince Joseph Antonin Poniatowski converged towards Minsk, blocking Prince Bagration's move to join Barclay. Severe deficiencies in transportation and distribution appeared early on, many even before the troops crossed the border. Furthermore, young recruits, a considerable proportion of the total force, were not able to sustain the exhausting pace of march and fell dead by the thousands. The summer heat, sweat, lice, and poor hygiene created the conditions to propagate typhus and dysentery. While the East Prussian depots had been filled to the hilt, provisions failed to reach the forward units on the scale and the time required. As the situation deteriorated, desertion and pillaging increased. The Lithuanians, initially welcoming and hopeful, became quickly alienated because of the invading troops' indiscipline and disregard for their property and well-being. Many men and animals became casualties, some even before crossing the Niemen River. After only a few days, the forces under Napoleon's direct command had 50,000 stragglers and had lost about 10,000 horses. The toll would only increase as days went by. Napoleon's tribulations, augmented after a veritable deluge, was unleashed on the center of the army that was moving along the Kovno-Vilna axis, started on June 29th. Torrential rains poured continuously for 4 days. The Viceroy of Italy, Eugène de Beauharnais, was forced to slow the pace of his Fourth Corps, which was not able to complete the crossing of the Niemen until July the 1st, 1812. Marshal Ney, operating northeast of Vilna with the Third Corps, reported significant problems as well. Over 40,000, or close to a quarter of the horses in the army, including those used for cavalry, were lost to exhaustion, illness, or malnutrition by mid-July 1812. Unable to define an optimal course of action, Napoleon dithered in Vilna. Restless, he dedicated himself to governing Lithuania, an activity that under other circumstances could be considered important, but in such a situation was a major distraction. Michael Adams has described this feverish state-building activity as a shrewd political move by Napoleon to deprive Russia of its northwestern provinces. Yet, appointing prefects and city council members could have been delegated and was certainly not urgent. With every day that passed, the army's fighting capabilities decreased. The impressive numerical strength of the Grande Armée fell sharply by the end of July 1812. The invaders found themselves in a difficult predicament soon after leaving Vilna, almost 1 month since crossing the Niemen, and had nothing to show for all their suffering. Napoleon's daily losses during the first 2 months of the campaign amounted to almost 4,000 men per day, 10 times the amount that the United States experienced during its devastating civil war 50 years later. Napoleon entered Vitebsk on July 29, 1812, with less than 50% of the force that crossed the Niemen, but the Russians had withdrawn again, avoiding the trap. Looking at the steep decline in the number of troops, it is not hard to call the expedition an unmitigated disaster by the last week of July 1812. In sum, the three major driving forces behind Napoleon's strategy in Russia were attack the enemy's army, not their capital city, decisively defeat the enemy close to the imperial frontier, finish the campaign in less than 1 month. The strong decline in military capabilities observed in the Grande Armée can be attributed to a combination of the following factors, many of them interdependent. Napoleon's extended stay in Vilna. This was especially significant given the style of leadership of the emperor and his talent as a military commander. Delays in gathering, processing, and acting on military intelligence. The inability of the commissariat to move foodstuffs and fodder in sufficient quantities from the well-provisioned depots in the rearguard to the front. The extreme heat, coupled with heavy rains that flooded a large proportion of the army's area of operations. The inferior quality of the horses purchased by the French army during the months preceding the invasion. Despite brilliantly orchestrated maneuvers, careful preparations, and a keen understanding of the logistical difficulties, Napoleon employed the Grande Armée beyond its capabilities, both in terms of distance and time. In the process, this impressive force was reduced beyond recognition before its major military engagement. I submit to you that it would be more accurate to declare that the French army was defeated by General Summer than Winter. In conclusion, the French emperor's extended stay in Vilna cost him the Russian campaign. Having failed to defeat the bulk of the Russian army within his set time frame of 3 weeks from the start of the war, Napoleon's audacious plan imploded, causing the downfall of the Grande Armée. By prolonging the campaign without sufficient resources, exhibiting an inexplicable optimism, Napoleon allowed his imagination to master facts. What followed would be disastrous, but the die was already cast on the Lithuanian plains. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mann. And we'll move on to Major Eric Smith's paper. And then what we'll do is we'll take the questions at the end. So that way we can go back and forth between the two papers. So Eric, take it away.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Everybody hear me? Awesome. Assume yes. All right. Bonaparte's capacities as a commander-in-chief were not yet fully developed when he overthrew the French government in 1799 and established himself as an enlightened dictator with the title of First Consul. Instead, the hero of Republican France was still fashioning his art of war as he gained experience and a better understanding of the science of war. The situation that confronted Bonaparte upon his assumption of power affords us the opportunity to observe his style of command at the highest level. Bonaparte liked giving directive orders, providing detailed explanations to subordinates on what to do and when. This style worked with some, but generated friction with more obstinate personalities. General of Division Jean Moreau, commanding the army, challenged Bonaparte at several turns and often refused to comply. Subordinate commanders also had issues cooperating with one another, disregarding guidance that directed them to do so. Bonaparte experienced significant friction in 1800, an experience that likely informed his decisions as emperor in the years to come. Napoleon Bonaparte seized the proverbial tiger by the tail when he ascended to power on 9 November 1799. A resurgent Chouan rebellion in Western France and Austrian armies along the Rhine and in northern Italy presented serious threats to French security. Should he fail to destroy France's enemies, his government would likely suffer the same fate as the Directory. The dueling problems on the Austrian on one front and the rebels on the other presented the first consul with a conundrum. The rebels possessed the potential to back a British conventional force should it land in Brittany or Normandy, whereas the Austrians possessed raw strength that could not be ignored. The first consul took a calculated risk and opted to deal with the Chouannerie first. In a move designed to place greater pressure on the Chouan-Vendée resurgence, the first consul declared the Western departments, quote, outside the Constitution, unquote, and under siege on 10 January 1800. Destroying this rebellion would be his first military effort as the commander-in-chief. To end the rebellion, Bonaparte appointed General Division Guillaume Brune to replace General of Brigade Gabriel Edouville as commander-in-chief of the Army of the West. The first consul named the destruction of Georges Cadadal's formations, located in the coastal region of Morbihan, as his overriding objective. Quote, from Nantes, march to Morbihan, scatter Georges Cadadal's formations, seize his cannons and the flour storehouses. Finally, begin to make the revolts in Morbihan feel all the weight and horrors of war, unquote. After Brune destroyed the main body of rebels, Citizen Bonaparte instructed him to crush any formations that appeared and, quote, make examples, unquote, likely a euphemism for public executions. He sent 6 additional letters to Brune over the next 6 weeks, emphasizing the destruction of rebel bands, a rapid disarmament of Western provinces, and the security posture of the region after the war. This amount of correspondence demonstrates the amount of attention Bonaparte paid to this campaign. Regardless of the number of letters sent to Brune, it did not translate into command throughout the region. Military forces assigned to secure the different divisions militaires operated semi-independently of the Army of the West. Bonaparte spent time sending individual instructions to many of these commanders between January and March of 1800. Orders to General of Division Gaspard Amédée Gardin, Commandant of the 14th Military Division, and General of Division Jacques-Marie Pilote la Berrolier, Commandant of the 13th Military Division, urged them to immediately take the fight to the Chouan. He scolded other commandants to take stronger action against the rebels. And to secure Paris and the Pas-de-Calais corridor, he entrusted a separate commander, General of Division François-Joseph Lefebvre, with the 14th, 15th, and 17th military divisions, and provided him alone over half a dozen letters between January and February of 1800. Bonaparte personally maneuvered each of these forces, numbering a few thousand troops apiece, and supported Brune's 60,000 troops to assure the destruction of the rebellion. The reasons Bonaparte commanded the destruction of the Chouannerie the way he did remain unknown. He relied on Brune to command the Army of the West. However, the first consul did not entrust Brune to command the Division Militaire as well. This seems deliberately inefficient. Perhaps the first consul distrusted either Brune's capacity to command, or he worried about handing so much power to a single officer in the aftermath of the coup. Regardless, his decision not to give Brune authority signals his insistence on bearing the burden of responsibility himself. This forced Citizen Bonaparte to micromanage the civil war in Western France by writing a plethora of letters to individual commanders over the course of 3 months. This reflects a penchant for directing action with guidance that penetrated below the levels of senior command, a style of leadership Bonaparte would continue to use throughout 1800. As he defeated the rebellion, the first consul simultaneously prepared for the spring counteroffensive against the Austrians. After naming Moreau as commander of the 100,000 plus strong Army of the Rhine, he shared with him his ideas about the upcoming campaign. Bonaparte advised him to posture his forces in a cordon along the Rhine, stretching from Constance to Basel, with his left extending as far as Strasbourg. From this position, he suggested a concentrated offensive over the Rhine from Switzerland, between Schaffhausen and Constance, using 3 bridges to ensure rapid concentration on the east bank. If successful, this effort would isolate Hungarian Feldzugmeister Krepal's left wing and compel the Austrians to retreat and risk pinning themselves against the upper Danube. The first consul also requested that Moreau be prepared to retask his corps occupying Switzerland to the Army of Reserve. This was a significant request, considering it asked for nearly 30% of Moreau's force. Overall, the first consul emphasized a vigorous attack, quote, leave nothing in Mens and your depot, assemble everything from Strasbourg to Constance, unquote. This would be an all-out offensive, not a half-hearted effort. Moreau rejected Bonaparte's idea. A consultation between the first consul and general division Jean-Joseph Paul Augustin de Sol, Moreau's aide-de-camp, occurred during mid-March in Paris. During this consultation, de Sol communicated Moreau's disagreements, stating that a crossing in a concentrated mass at a confined geographic point incurred too much risk if the Austrians received advance warning of the passage. Instead, Moreau intended to feint crossings near the Black Forest to distract the Austrians. In summary, de Sol advised the first consul to let Moreau do as he pleased. Quote, "If you insist on the execution of your ideas, you will upset him, you will even offend him, and you will obtain nothing from him," unquote. Even with these compromises, the first consul still ordered the Army of the Rhine to attack no later than 10 or 20 April to support the Army of the Reserve, and that the corps in Switzerland be made available to the Army of the Reserve as previously discussed. Realizing that he could not force Moreau's hand further, Bonaparte decided he would win in Italy. Quote, "What he dares not do in the Rhine, I will do on the Alps. He may regret the glory which he relinquishes to me," unquote. Based on this statement, the experience of developing a campaign concept and having Moreau subsequently reject it frustrated Bonaparte and probably marked him as a difficult personality. Along these lines, Bonaparte now planned to regain the Republic's losses in northern Italy. He would accomplish this by using the remnant of the Army of Italy to withstand Austrian pressure while constructing the Army of the Reserve to strike a decisive blow. On 25 January, he ordered 3 corps to be organized and assembled at Lyon, Dijon, and Chalon-sur-Marne. In Italy, the first consul depended on André Massena. True to form, Bonaparte offered very detailed instruction to Massena on how to defend Piedmont. "If the enemy assembles on the Spezia coast in order to attack you at the same time from Nové and Maintenon, leave only a light corps on the Col de Tende. For 2 months, the snow will defend it sufficiently. And anyways, the enemy cannot approach Nice. If I were in your place, I would have at Genoa 4/5 of my forces. Thus, if the total rises to 50,000 men, I would have 40,000 positions to support Genoa, 2,500 in the Alps, 1,500 in the Sospel and Tende Heights, 2,500 for the Antibes garrison, etc., and others along a circumference, 2 days from Genoa. In this situation, I would not fear anything that the enemy threw at Genoa," unquote. However, Feldzeugmeister Michael Friedrich Medela demonstrated the expression that the enemy always gets a vote. On 5 April, Melas attacked south to seize Genoa with 90,000 troops. Despite the advantages of terrain, the French could not withstand a simultaneous attack against a force double their size. Melas' attack split Massena's force in half, centering his periphery forces southward to Borghetto and the other half westward towards Savona. Penned in Genoa, Massena could keep the Austrians occupied, but not indefinitely. Massena's situation and Moreau's unexpected tardiness affected the first consul's decisions. Bonaparte needed Massena to hold the Austrians in front of him and Moreau to cross the Rhine in order for the Army of the Reserve to safely traverse the Alps. However, the agreed upon date of 20 April came and went without the Army of the Rhine beginning its offensive. This delay increased risk for both Massena and Bonaparte. Anxious about Moreau's inaction, Bonaparte considered crossing the Alps without support from the Army of the Rhine and began maneuvering the Army of the Reserve out of its assembly areas toward Geneva on 24 April. As he did so, Bonaparte ordered Carnot to implore Moreau to begin his offensive. Quote, "The telegraph today from Basel and Strasbourg informs me of nothing new. Reiterate the order to Moreau to attack the enemy. Make him feel that his delays fundamentally compromise the security of the Republic," unquote. Moreau did swing into action 5 days late on 25 April. He conducted a complex series of feints over the Rhine, which deceived Cray about his intent. These feints, which crossed 3 separate courts, Strasbourg, Breisach, and Basel, enticed Cray into advancing into the Black Forest to contain the invasion. Moreau waited until 27 April before rapidly hopscotching back over the Rhine and crossing again, pressing around the flank of Kray's force in the Black Forest. This maneuver revealed Kray's error. The Austrians had advanced too far forward into the difficult terrain of the Black Forest to react with any grace. In response to the sudden appearance of two French corps on their left, Austrian elements began withdrawing to protect their exposed flanks. On 1 May, Moreau ordered General of Division Jacques-Claude Lecourb's corps to cross the Rhine from Switzerland. Ostensibly allocated to support the Army of the Reserve at Bonaparte's request, it now firmly committed to the German theater. With 3 French corps concentrated on his left, Kray withdrew rather than face destruction. Moreau's success did not come quite fast enough for Bonaparte, though. The Army of the Reserve needed to cross the Alps before Massena capitulated. Austrian pressure on Massena in early April, and Moreau's inaction up to 25 April, left Bonaparte uncertain about his situation for an uncomfortably long period of time. On the 27th, Bonaparte shifted the crossing from the Gotthard to the St. Bernard Pass due to the lack of confidence afforded by Moreau's maneuvers up to that point. By the 27th, Bonaparte now only had 3 weeks to reach Massena before his rations ran out. With this in mind, Bonaparte intended for his lead elements to reach the far side of the Alps no later than 22 or 23 May. Given the risky scheme of maneuver and the already difficult nature of crossing the Alps, the margin for error was very tiny. The delay in crossing the Alps, combined with other military friction, forced Bonaparte to change his plans yet again. 2 weeks after Moreau established his foothold across the Rhine, the Army of the Reserve finally began crossing the Alps on 14 May. Its lead elements now had 8 or 9 days to reach Aoste on the far side of the Alps. With Lecourb's corps committed to the German theater, Bonaparte sent a request to Moreau to send General of Division Bon-Adrien Jeannot de Moncey's smaller corps into Piedmont via the Simplon Pass. However, its late arrival meant it would not arrive in time to influence the crossing. During their maneuver through the Great St. Bernard Pass, Austrian forces defending a small fortress named Fort Bard delayed the movement of artillery and heavy baggage. Lannes' vanguard managed to bypass the fort, trailblazing a path for other infantry to follow him. After seizing the far side of the crossing by sea at Evrea on 22 May, Lannes could not advance further. Without the artillery and trains still stranded in front of Fort Bard, advancing on Genoa and Milhaud's force would be a risky proposition. Instead of this, Bonaparte chose to cut Milhaud's lines of communication with Austria. On 25 May, the first consul ordered Lannes to seize Chivasso on the Po River in order to mask an offensive aimed at Milan. General Division Joachim Murat would advance with General Division Philibert Guillaume Duhem in support. Unlike an offensive aimed at the core of Milhaud's strength, this eastward attack would go into Austrian weakness and threaten to cut their lines of communication with Vienna. After seizing Milan, Bonaparte turned west and pulled off a victory at Marengo. The Austrian commander's passivity in the face of French maneuvers led Bonaparte to incorrectly assume Milhaud had no interest in fighting and intended to escape. Accordingly, Bonaparte positioned his forces to cut Milhaud's lines of retreat out of Alessandria. However, Milhaud outnumbered him by nearly 5,000 troops and now intended to attack to break out. When Milhaud crossed the Bormida River on the morning of 14 June, Victor and Lannes' corps fought bravely, but fell back under overwhelming pressure. Bonaparte effectively lost the battle by 3 p.m., and only the timely appearance of Desai's corps salvaged the situation. Fresh troops galvanized the French line and turned the tide 1 hour later. Out of options, Milan negotiated the Convention of Alessandria, and the following month, Moreau's success in the Rhine theater put a halt to all fighting. The armistice with Austria and victory in Italy generated new plans for the war. In conjunction with Moreau's Army of the Rhine, the first consul now planned to combine the strengths of the Army of the Grisons with the Army of Italy to pressure Austria's southern flank. The Army of the Grisons, commanded by General Division Etienne Jacques-Joseph Alexander MacDonald, would cross the Alps via the Splugen Pass and seize Trent in conjunction with the left wing of the Army of Italy. From there, it would follow the Brenta River valley toward Bassano, cutting off Austrian forces defending a line on the Mincio River. Brune would support this effort with the Army of Italy. Quote, General MacDonald has orders to extend his army as far as the Valtelline. This must complement the military operations because this region will continue to be a part of the Cisalpine. By this method, the troops of the Army of Italy will be more concentrated, and General MacDonald can support your army with his right or even with his entire army, if this would be necessary, unquote. Pressuring Austrian forces to accept battle on unequal terms or withdraw would place pressure on Austria's southern flank. With Moreau maneuvering in the Rhine theater, the Austrians would be caught on the horns of a dilemma. MacDonald held reservations about the concept. The plan called for an Alpine crossing during November when snow and ice would present a greater problem than it had for Bonaparte. To air his concerns, MacDonald sent his aide Matthew Dumas to speak with the first consul. Patiently listening to Dumas, Bonaparte, quote, teased out this great chaos of the Alps between the Rhine and the Diege, unquote, over a large map and explained to Dumas the grand scheme. Quote, we will force them to move, he said, and almost without fighting, this immense fortress of the Tyrol. You must maneuver on their flanks, threatening their line of retreat. They will immediately withdraw from the high valleys. I understand there are presumable difficulties greater than other points in the Alps, but I hold that there are not impassable features on the glacier that the men could not overcome. Tell MacDonald that an army can always pass in any season wherever two men can put their feet. He must, 15 days after the resumption of hostilities, be at the sources of the Adda, the Oglio, and the Adige, that he draw fire from the Tonal Mountain, and that arriving at Trent, he forms the left of the Army of Italy, maneuvering against the trail elements of Henrique Bellegarde, unquote. Dumas offered this guidance to MacDonald, who now resolved to accomplish his assigned mission despite his concerns. After a difficult passage over the Alps, MacDonald attempted to coordinate with Brune to achieve the first consul's intent. Dumas departed to liaise with the commander of the Army of Italy, asking Brune to delay his offensive. If Brune attacked before MacDonald could get into position, Austrian forces arrayed on the Mincio River would likely recognize the danger and slip away. Interestingly, Brune did not cooperate and opted to make his assault across the Mincio independent of MacDonald's actions. In his conference with Brune, Dumas learned that the Army of Italy's commander made this decision based on, quote, the brilliant success of General Dupont at Bussolengo, the good dispositions of General Marmont, and the fine feat of arms of General Oudinot, unquote. Although this incident proved a moot point in the context of Moreau's smashing victory at Hohenlinden, it revealed that the first consul's authority did not extend past his personal supervision. Bonaparte's experiences in 1800 likely taught him that he never wished to have anything less than complete control in future endeavors. The first consul imposed a very detail-oriented command approach on the military he inherited from the Directory. He did not entrust Brune with complete command of the war against the Chouannerie and assumed the burden of personally directing the actions of local commanders throughout the region. He succeeded in crushing the rebellion in this style. However, employing the same approach with Moreau generated friction. The refusal to listen to Bonaparte's concept, the 5-day delay in attacking across the Rhine, and the unfilled request for Lecourbe's corps left the first consul in a tenuous position before and after the Army of the Reserve crossed the Alps. The friction between MacDonald and Brune suggests that the first consul's intent could be easily ignored without his personal presence. This harrowing experience likely taught Napoleon that strong-willed commanders could serve as a liability. Despite holding the reins of government, Bonaparte lacked the authority to forcefully impose military directives on others. This insecurity would be eliminated during future campaigns via the construction of a system designed to enable effective military campaign. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We had two great papers, and now I'd like to turn it over to some questions. So our first question comes from Professor John Kuhn from the Naval War College for Mr. Mann, and it's regarding the wastage of horses. Do you have any details on numbers in particular regarding horses that were drawing the wagons and the artillery? Was there a higher wastage amongst those horses?
Yes, thank you, Ken. There is indeed a paper that has been written on the subject, and it specifies that out of the 140,000 horses, about 50,000 or so were involved in just moving artillery and other draft work. There was 55,000 oxen that were also engaged in the transportation of foodstuffs and other supplies.
And then, oops, sorry. Sorry, I just had audio feedback there. And then just to switch gears, for Eric, we have a question from Daniel Cooper from the University of Alabama. Roll Tide. I'm, living in Alabama, I'm legally obligated to say that. As mentioned earlier, Bonaparte's leadership style worked for some and also dissuaded others. While this paper focused on 1800, have you come across other examples of this? For in particular, Mr. Cooper was thinking of like in Marengo or in 1814.
So after this, I've started looking at actually the invasion of Portugal and the numerous invasions of Portugal, and there's a parallel between how he ran the Chouannerie, where he had all of these different little pieces in the military divisions, and then he had Brune doing the main effort, but not really giving him the authority. I see a lot of the same things happening in Spain and Portugal, where he gives orders, and with Massena in particular, he reassures Massena, you'll have complete control to be able to draw forces from other portions of Spain in support of you. And then when it comes down to it, nobody does anything to actually support him. And Sewell in his memoirs makes a similar complaint about how it is that nobody actually cooperates with each other outside of that. And although it's so, this is sort of what interests me, is the command and control is so disjointed, because he does give Joseph nominal authority to command, but then says all the orders have to flow through the Minister of War in Paris. So the short answer is yes, I have.
Okay. Perfect. No, it's a good answer. Yeah, it's very interesting. Looking at these two papers, it really made me think so far of, Karl von Clausewitz's quote on friction, right? Everything in war is simple, but the simplest thing is difficult, right? In case of, simple plans, weather. So, which gets to a question. In fact, we've kind of had this question from a couple of people. So first from John Curtis from Cork University. And in fact, we just got a similar question, but this is to Claudio Mann. We're getting an echo here. I'm getting an echo. All right. So
no, we're good, Kenny. We're good.
Okay. Given the difficulties, Claudio, you described outside of Napoleon's control, how could he have actually used those 2 weeks that you talk about to actually, could he have actually won the battle? Is most people's question, right? Like, you talk about all of these difficulties. What could have you done with those 2 weeks?
Obviously, it's a difficult question, given the fact that there were indeed some aspects beyond his control. My reaction to the question is that I believe there was an opportunity for Napoleon to recognize that things had not gone according to the plan and adjust his plan from a diplomatic or military standpoint. I think that the point that I'm trying to make is similar to one that David Stahel has made on the Eastern Front campaign of the German army in 1941. And that is, when you have a certain amount of resources that allow you to complete your plan in a certain time frame, if you have not been able to do so, you need to readjust your whole framework. And that may mean just simply to hold on in there and try to start some sort of diplomatic negotiations. I'm not going to sort of second guess Napoleon. That would be really temporary from my part. But I just simply want to say that when things didn't go the way he planned, and he had already pretty much exhausted his resources, there was a call to rethink the whole strategy. And that's the main point that I'm trying to make here.
Oh, good. And then back to Eric, we've got a question that I'd kind of like to pose, which is how does Napoleon's command and control style compare to not only other countries, at the time, say the Austrians, but also maybe how does this compare to the organization of his predecessor, right? When Carnot, for example, was dictating, military operations.
That's a really excellent question.
Well, thank you. I asked it. No,
no. Well, because I think of it from the European. I'm tracking that the question is directed at the European commanders, other European commanders. I do remember at some point in graduate school going through actually Washington's papers and how he was trying to run the Continental Army at that time. And I saw a lot of great similarities, that there's a lot of very directive action on his part. And I was just utterly floored by the number of letters that he wrote in a single day to what I would call just herding cats and dogs, eaches. I have to talk to this guy, I have to talk, and there's not a lot of headspace for him to think. So I would offer that it's perhaps similar. That's my hypothesis. I don't know if I got after it, sir, if that's what you wanted.
No, yeah, looking at Napoleon as part of it, but yeah, thinking of at the time, how does Napoleon's command style compare to, say, his opponents, right? The Austrians, for example, the Brits, and I know this is more of just food for thought. I know you're working on the dissertation, so.
Thank you. I'm taking that for action.
And then next, let's see. Oh, let me go back here. We have a question from Alan Salazar to you, Mr. Mann. Would a defensive strategy for Napoleon been better to deploy on the Russian front?
Well, also excellent question, very difficult to answer. I think that Napoleon had an excellent idea when he refused his right and attacked with his army to turn Barclay's right. And so the whole concept was well conceived. But we need to keep in mind that the Russians had really exercised a clever strategy to avoid some of the mistakes that the Austrians have incurred in the past. In other words, I think that we find here a situation where the Russians had taken measure of Napoleon's intentions and style. And I don't think that necessarily that the defensive strategy was better. I think that the point that I'm trying to emphasize in my paper is that by going beyond his capabilities, when the army was very weakened significantly, both in terms of manpower and supplies, then the destiny of the Grand Army was already defined before the first battle. From a strategic point of view, I think that the defensive strategy was incompatible with Napoleon's style. He was an offensive leader. So I'm not saying at all that his maneuver was a mistake. What I'm just saying is that once it failed, he had to rethink and regroup and then plan a second campaign, perhaps.
Thank you. We have another question. This coming from Dan Hollins for Eric, which is the question of, given Napoleon's continued use to exercise direct instruction to his commander in later campaigns, is it more of the case that Napoleon never really changed his style, and looking at sort of the core structure that's set up later, is that really a sort of myth that's created by later historians in terms of this decentralized core, or is this just sort of a continuation?
That is actually sort of where the question that my dissertation is sort of going to engage. I don't know if it's going to be the main point of it, but it will be part of it. What I noticed is that short answer is yes, he does. However, I think that at least during the 1813 campaign, at certain points, based on his correspondence, there's a sense that he realizes that he can't control everything himself, especially in the latter half of it. There's phrases that he uses. I cannot foresee all situations. You have to consider for what the situation is on the ground and to adjust to it. But what's more interesting is that he doesn't do this for everyone. For example, with Ney, he's exceptionally directive. He gives him about this much space to consider thinking for himself. With other folks, right offer with Eugene Beauharnais, he gives a great deal of leeway and talks to him very freely about his thoughts. Marmont also sort of gets that privilege as well. So he is very acutely aware of the different personalities that he has working for him and what their individual capabilities are. And he tries to employ them in a fashion that matches that. Unfortunately, he doesn't always have as deep a bench, I think, as he would like, in terms of what I'd say, a player that can do every position. He doesn't have that. And so when he's forced to I have to keep giving directive orders in situations where it's just straight up not going to work, because this guy only really works well when I give him express instructions. And I also find that there's on occasion you find marshals that are just look, the emperor didn't tell me to, so I'm just going to get my head taken clean off if I disobey. So here I sit and I wait for further instructions. I hope that answers the question.
No, that's a good one, and yeah, it's very fascinating to watch. You can see also Napoleon is very much that way with his brothers, right? As he's corresponding, his guidance to each brother is very tailored to their personality. And I would also posit it would be another interesting campaign to look at. And in fact, when you mentioned Spain earlier, my mind went instantly to 1808. When you look at his course, the way he used Murat in 1808 is fascinating, because in my mind, I think he's kind of almost trying to teach Murat how to be that sort of vice general, to run a theater commander. It doesn't go very well, but Napoleon is staying back but yet issuing Murat orders while giving Murat nominally operational control. So yeah, fascinating concept to look at. So I'm really looking forward to what you'll be coming up with. And let's see, we've got, we're almost to the end of the time. So there's a lot of questions that are still left. Let's see here. One last one here from Richard Coet, which is, do you think Napoleon's unflagging optimism in the face of so many obstacles was a genuine personality trait? Was it a wishful thinking, or was he putting on a brave front for the sake of morale?
Is that for me?
Yeah, sorry, for you, Claudio.
Okay.
But honestly, I think both of you could answer that. Yeah.
It's an excellent way to wrap it up. I truly believe that Napoleon had a tendency to minimize obstacles, and that he had a lot of sort of self-confidence that at times was taken to an extreme. And we've seen that not only in Russia, we've seen it in other situations, especially during the campaign of 1813. My sense is that it was indeed a personality trait, but it was exacerbated as he developed a level of self-confidence, with all the surrounding environment, as well as obviously the excellent results that he achieved until perhaps 1807, 1808. So that reinforced a personality trait of his.
Yeah, and if I could jump in real
Yeah,
quick.
yeah.
So I think that there's, I think I want to take it one step further. Is it a personality trait or is it a leadership trait? And that you try and say, well, and what I mean by that is what's often posited is that, Bonaparte underestimated the size of the enemy force, and then he overestimated the size of the friendly force. And that was a means of sort of augmenting the confidence of folks. And when you go through the memoirs, it's almost every single time, Bonaparte always sold me short on what I was going to be given, and then he undersold the enemy. So I asked the question, what my hypothesis is that because Bonaparte was just trying to encourage them to get it done? Did he understand what I would call like the delta in resources, so the difference in terms of, I have so many theaters and so many obligations to fill that I know that I can't give this guy everything under the moon here to accomplish it. So the best I can offer you is a good pep talk. I'm not trying to be flippant, but there's something there for that. And I am curious about that myself.
No, I kind of fall in between the two of those, right? I really think there's both, every time I read Napoleon's correspondence regarding the Navy, his optimism, right, is just astounding, right? Like, well, we'll have 130 ships, right? Like you've told me this, which in some parts I think it's a personality, but then I think, Eric, you put a nice twist to that, which is how much of that is also leadership of, hey, I want to have, as anyone in the military knows, like stoplight charts, right? Like if I have this metric that I can beat you over the head with, am I using that to motivate you to try and meet it? Like, does Napoleon actually really expect in certain cases to people meet those? And again, this is where I say that there may be part of that, but if you don't meet those, even if they're very optimistic, it's not like, oh, okay, move on. I mean, you're getting a very stern, nasty letter. So it's always hard to discern like how much of that is true optimism and how much of that is just sort of leadership, showmanship. And I kind of fall in between. It's a little bit of both.
And Ken, if I may just add, there is an interesting period in Napoleon's life when he lived in Corsica as a young man, and when he took responsibilities, first in terms of resisting the French, and later on as he took responsibilities for the French in Corsica. And I think that we see there as well his drive, his aggressive nature, and his sort of capacity to gamble, if you will, that I feel, being as he was at the time very young, shows a personality trait that never left him.
Well, again, I'd like to thank our two panelists for wonderful papers, and thank you everyone for your great questions. I'm sorry for those that we didn't get to. We had so many come through, but I tried to answer those that would kind of ask those that would kind of touch upon multiple questions. So thank you very much. And so please, I guess we'll take a quick break as we get ready. A round of applause, a virtual applause for our panelists, and we'll get ready for the next session in about 10 minutes.